This is Run with Fitpage, your audio encyclopedia for all things running. Learn, train, improve. And now your host, Vikas Singh.
Ian Sharman is an USA track and field certified ultrarunning coach and is based in Orlando, USA. He's an ultrarunning magazine columnist and runner for ultrarunning, has represented England and been selected for the Great Britain 100K team. Ian has completed over 200 ultra and marathons in over 30 countries globally in almost every type of weather and terrain conditions. He is 4 times Leadville Trail 100 miles champion, 3 times Rocky Raccoon 100 miles champion, Grand Slam of ultra running record holder, and 9 times top 10 finisher at Western States 100. Some of his personal records include 100 miles in 12 hours 44 minutes, marathon in 2 hours and 21 minutes, and a 10K downhill training run in 29 minutes and 40 seconds, among many other distance personal records. In today's podcast, we will discuss a range of topics on road running and ultra running, including trail running. We will start by knowing a bit more about Ian's running journey to draw inspiration and underline traits in how he has been able to perform at the very top level for such a long time. Additionally, we will talk about setting up the right goals, intrinsic motivation, how to stay on track and not give up. And towards the end, we will talk about ultra running training and racing specifically in hot conditions. I am super excited to speak with Ian. Let's get started. Ian, welcome to Run with Fitpage.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started with very start of your professional running career. It has been nothing sort of an inspirational journey. How about we give a sneak peek of how you got hooked to it? When did you start with running? And also more importantly, did you play any other sport before running? How you got to where you got to?
Yeah, I didn't really start off as a runner. I'm 40 now. It seems like I've been in this sport a long time, but I still kind of think of it as quite new because I didn't do it growing up. So I started off playing all the typical things you'd expect in England, although I live in the US now. I come from the UK originally. So I played soccer, I played cricket, I'm sure your listeners will be more interested in the cricket side of it than the other ones, but played a bit of rugby, field hockey, tennis, squash, a little bit of everything really. So I was very active. And then started working in London at a company called Deloitte, one of the big accountancy firms, and found that I just wasn't being nearly as active really overall, just not really living the normal lifestyle that I got used to growing up. So after a few years of living in London, I decided I need to do a little bit more, and happened at that moment to see a TV show about a race called the Marathon des Sables in the Sahara Desert. And so that just seemed really cool. I'd always loved travel. In fact, I spent a month in India for my dissertation at university. So I went all over, even was briefly in Mumbai, where I believe you are.
Yeah.
It was just really cool just seeing different places around the world. And this idea of seeing the Sahara Desert and doing a race there really appealed, and the idea of getting fit for it. So that was when I was 24 that I saw that. And then I really started running and had my first race when I was 25. And then I've just done 200 plus marathons and ultras now, plus a load of half marathons and other distances. But just found that I really enjoyed it and found it quite addictive as well. That it's, once you get into it, it's so enjoyable to do more of it. You get to meet so many people. It's a great way to see new places. And because of that, I think I just found that it overtook my life. And then I've been coaching for the last 10 years now, or last 11 years now, because I switched over soon after I moved to the US to become a full-time runner and coach, because I started getting enough success and some sponsors. So coaching was the natural next step.
Oh, wow. So you got inspiration from MDS. Did you move to ultra races right away, or you started with marathons and then eventually gradually moved to ultra?
Yeah, basically ultras immediately. So from the point where I saw that TV show, I then entered the MDS, but you had to do it quite a long way in advance back then. So it was about 18 months away. So that gave me 18 months to train for 150 miles, 240 kilometers over 1 week in the desert. And so I think I did a couple of road marathons, maybe 6 months after I started training. First one was in Prague, which so in the Czech Republic, really beautiful place to run. Then 2 weeks later, I did one in Stockholm in Sweden. And so it was fitting in with the idea of travel. That was really the thing that appealed. But I thought, before I do this thing in the desert, the longest stage is about an 80K. So I wanted to do something around that distance. I wanted to do an ultra before going out there. And so I did something called the London to Brighton double marathon,
Mhm.
basically just over a double marathon. It was about 54 miles. So that's about just under 90K. And that was actually the last year they ever did that road race. It was a classic one that had been around for 50 plus years. And I did that, and I'm running along, and halfway through, I'm thinking, wow, I can't run anymore. I'm going to have to walk, and I feel bad. And then a few minutes later, I think, no, I can run again. This, I took some food,
Right.
and everything's working again. And so that happened again 3/4 of the way through the race. And same thing, I stopped running at least and slowed down, walked for 10 minutes, and then kept running. And at the end of the race, I thought, that wasn't quite as hard as I thought it would be. I thought it'd be this insanely impossible edge of what the human body can do. And yet it was difficult, but it wasn't so much more difficult than running a marathon. And so I thought I can probably do a little bit more of this. But I also did think at that point I probably wouldn't do many ultras, and that I kind of like road marathons, and maybe that would be my thing. But I do like both of those, in fairness.
Wow. I've seen people graduating from 5Ks to 10K half and full. And I see you started from double marathon and moved to ultras. It's fantastic. So can we reflect on this a bit more and see how did you just go about goal setting? I know you told that you were fairly active even before running, and so possibly you had some or a lot of aerobic base before you got started with running. But how should people really approach a goal? How should they go about goal setting? What are some of the things that you learned when you got started, and if there are some synergies that people can take when they get started?
Definitely. I would say that that was exactly how I thought of it. That my goal was, I have 18 months to train for this ultra marathon, this multi-stage race. And so I was just trying to think, okay, well, how do I backfill from that? Where do I need to be 3 months before that? Where do I need to be 6 months before? What kind of benchmarks do I need to achieve along the way? So I thought, I've got to at least be able to do a marathon. So I've got to try that out. And given that this race involves doing almost a marathon distance for several of the days, and one of the days is a double marathon, I thought, I've got to try an ultra as well. So the goals there were all based on getting me to where I'd need to be for doing this big epic thing that got me interested in the first place. So I'd say that that would definitely be something anyone could take away from this. It doesn't matter what distance you're looking at. Maybe you see a half marathon as your big goal, and you think, okay, how am I going to get fit to run a half marathon? Well, I've probably got to run a 5K and a 10K, and doing that as a race rather than just covering that same distance is giving you a little bit more formality behind it. It forces you to train a little bit harder. And then when you're in the race environment, that's really good for goal setting, because it gives you a bit more objectivity, and it's easier to push yourself typically when other people are around, and when there's a little bit more on the line than if you just run 5 kilometers on your own. So I think it's just good to think, what is the big thing you're aiming for? And then what are some of the intermediate markers you need to do? And how long would it take to get those into those intermediate markers, so that you don't rush trying to build up?
Sure. Very interesting. Now let's reflect on, from your experience, what happens when you find it hard to keep going and drop off. It's been an incredible long journey for you, and I'm sure you've had these experiences a number of times where you fall off the cliff in certain ways. That is, you're not able to stick to your goal, and you keep dropping off. Whether it is dropping off from a fitness journey or achieving any other aspirational goal, what's the psychology behind it, and how to identify signs early on, whether it's a fatigue signs, overtraining, or anything else, and how can people correct it when they are on an aspirational journey for long term, for example?
I would say the one word that's really important here is habit. Whether it is trying to get into the habit of training, whether it's something else in life that you're trying to succeed at, whether it's in a race and you're trying to make sure that you can be mentally tough and get through the difficult parts. In all of these cases, it's basically by forcing your body and mind to get used to doing that thing. So if it's just easing into running at the first stage of doing that, it's trying to make sure that you maybe set yourself some goals that you can achieve. You want to have success from that. So don't just set yourself the maximum you think you could do along the way. Set yourself something you could maybe do. So let's say you've never run before. So you set yourself 1 kilometer is the first day. And then you have a day off. And the next time you're going to try and do 1.5 kilometers. And you're just gradually building it. It's not like every run has to be more than the last one. In fact, that would be a very bad idea. But by doing that, you can start to create the habit that you're a runner. And so it's the same thing with getting through a difficult part of a race. If you've done lots and lots of hard races, whether it's the same style, maybe one's in a desert, one's in a mountain, and so there's similarities, but different circumstances, different things that can go wrong. Every time that you force yourself through that, and you're also getting that habit through training. So if you have a long run and you want to cut it short, or you're on Sunday or something and you don't want to go out and you end up doing less or not doing what you'd originally aimed for, then that is creating the habit of backing off and not achieving what you're aiming for. While every time you kind of take the hard road, it helps to make you tougher and keep things going. So I will have a word of caution to say about that in just a second. But a good example would be not cutting corners. I remember when I was a student and I'd do occasional little bits of running. This was before I really got into running. And I'd run around basically around the football pitch. And you could cut the corner very easily. And in fact, the way that you could tell most people had run did cut the corner just a little bit. It's only a few meters shorter than going right into the corner. But I would always make sure I went right into the right angle of that corner, because in my head, I was thinking, if you always pick the slightly harder route, then every time something that happens within training, within life, within a race that is harder, you just take it in your stride and you say, yeah, the harder thing often happens. I have no issue with that. While if you're always trying to make things a little bit easier, always just cutting that corner a little bit, and I don't mean by cheating, I just mean by picking the easier option sometimes. So maybe you've got time to do a 10K or a 9K, and you just say, well, I'll do the 10K today. I'll cover that distance to make sure that it is the slightly harder of the two options. So I think that's a really important thing for then reinforcing the habit of being mentally tough and reinforcing the ability to deal with things no matter what it is. So it's a skill set that goes beyond having to be knowledgeable or skilled at that exact thing. It could just be that in one race you had one problem and you overcame it. Another race you have a totally different problem. But because of that ability to just deal with the problem, move on, not get put off by it, and still be able to push yourself, you'll be able to get through that as well. So the caveat I would put on that is you don't want to be getting too stubborn with your habits. So if you're injured, for example, if you're overtrained, these are not times where you just say, well, I've got to be tough today. I'm meant to do a 30K long run, so I'm just going to do a 30K even though I have a broken bone. You know, that's an obviously stupid thing to do, but it's often more subtle than that. Like maybe you've just got a sore knee and you're not sure what you should do. So you don't just go through it regardless. You've got to be thinking about, does this make sense in terms of making you fitter, aiding your training, getting you where you want to be, and being very honest with yourself about that. So you don't just find excuses all the time, but if there's a genuine reason to adjust the training, then to do that. And that's something you might have to do multiple times a week. With my own personal training, I'm constantly adjusting it day by day based on how I feel. So I've got an idea of what I'm going to achieve that week, but I'll move it around based on picking the right days to push myself a little bit harder, as well as allowing for things like real life, like, you know, there's more time one day than another day. So I think it can be very difficult to do that for a lot of people, that they either get really set on being super tough and hardcore, or they find lots of excuses. But if you can find the way to be smart with that, then it'll allow you to do well in races and not just be causing harm to your body by overtraining or getting ill or getting injured. And usually the early signs of some form of overtraining or injury are just the early little bits of either feeling things are a little bit harder. And so just be monitoring things day by day, asking yourself how you feel. Maybe you just find that you're unable to complete workouts. That's definitely a red flag. Or if you get 2 or 3 runs in a row that just feel significantly worse than you expect, then at the very least make some little changes, usually just by backing off a little bit, and that'll make it more possible to get back on track. And so that's what I'd usually say. It's much easier to fix any problem in training or racing if you can identify it earlier and fix it when it's a small problem rather than waiting till it gets much worse.
Very important, and the point specifically around where you talked about, Jan, that people need to accept that the way they plan, not necessarily everything is going to go that way, and it's fine if they don't achieve, while keeping progressively harder goals. Trying to achieve that is a great mindset, but as you get started, if you find that you can't go there because of some limitation, I think it's much better to accept it than just trying to be nervous about it, trying to get upset because of that, and then maybe have longer recurring complications. So from there, I had another question. Do you have any personal experiences where you got demotivated because of an injury or something like that, and how did you overcome that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I've had a few more injuries in the last few years than I used to. I used to be very lucky that my body was able to withstand a decent amount of training and racing and didn't really pick up injuries. The last 2 or 3 years, I've had a little bit more. Things like my left Achilles has been a bit of a problem, but something that's been manageable. So I usually find that it's the same mentality that will help you overcome a difficulty in a race, will help you also deal with any other difficulties, whether it is COVID and lockdowns, whether it is work related stuff, family related stuff, training related things where things are not going as you want them to be, which is to say, okay, well, how can I learn from this? How can I make myself better by adapting to this and then either stopping it from happening again or at least working on some areas that are useful anyway? So when I've had injuries in the past, I've typically thought, okay, well, the good side of this, always try and look on the positives, is I get a little bit of a break because as a runner doing a lot of training for ultras, then it's easy to kind of never really give yourself as much of an off season as you need, particularly if you're not getting injured. I think a lot of people just keep going until they do get injured. So anytime something goes a little bit wrong there, that is definitely a plus point, that it will give you a little bit of a physical and mental break from the stresses of hard training. And so you may well come back fitter and stronger. It also allows you to work on any relative weaknesses. So maybe you're unable to run, but you could work a little bit more on some core strength, or you could work a little bit more on reading some useful books about the mental side of training and learn a little bit more there. So it's not like it's all bad when something goes wrong like that. And I found that I now don't get even really annoyed if I get an injury. I just say, okay, well, these things happen. What can I learn from it to avoid it happening again? And how can I make myself a better runner in the meantime? And then come back excited, motivated, and ready to keep going rather than allowing myself to do nothing and then maybe eat too much food and then have the difficulty of losing some weight as well as getting back into shape and getting the running fitness back. So I think it maybe sounds like a simple idea there, but it's almost just being hyper rational, that a willingness to try and take the emotion out of it, because it's always frustrating if something goes wrong. But the quicker you can move beyond the annoyance and the frustration and the why did this happen to me, and instead say, well, things have happened. The situation has changed. Now, how do I deal with this new situation? Which is, again, exactly what you want to do in a race. If something isn't going to plan, you want to be able to say, okay, well, maybe I'm not feeling as good as I thought. Maybe I've got blisters and I didn't think that would happen. So can't undo that now. That's in the past. But what can I do from this point to the end of the race or to whatever goal you're heading towards to optimize the new situation? And it is difficult to do that, but and a lot of it is just about being able to get rid of the ego elements of, well, I wanted to do particularly well in the first place, and now maybe that's not possible. But what is the new possibility? And the really important message from this is often you'll find that much more satisfying. Having a build up to a race and then a race where everything goes well doesn't have actually as much meaning as having obstacles along the way and then overcoming them as well as you possibly can. And really, I think that's why ultras are so appealing, because the ultra distances, you always get some stuff going wrong. For someone training for the half marathon or marathon, a good day means that basically it all goes to plan. You keep your pacing right and you get a successful race. In an ultra, it's more that you will have some things go wrong, but you identify them quickly, you deal with them quickly, you minimize them and come out the other side. And because that's a very difficult thing to do, it just means so much to do it successfully. And it's not like no matter how experienced you are, you won't do it perfectly every time. You're still going to get the world's best runners not finishing races or finishing further back than they should occasionally, because getting all of those things lined up is a very, very difficult skill. And it's both a physical and a mental skill, and one that improves with practice and experience. But still, with experience, you can get more ego, and that can get in the way.
Sure, it's more like accepting the limitations and making do with the available resources instead of getting upset with this is what I took away from here. Thanks for
Being
that.
very realistic is a part of it. And that's something where experience allows you to be more realistic, because you can work out, okay, well, what is the best case scenario here? But it's making sure that you're not just putting new limitations on yourself that are artificial. Often your main limitation is going to be your mind, not your body. So if you think that you can't do something physically, you often don't know until you try. And the perfect example of this is my experience of just with running and pretty much everyone I've ever coached, which is you think you can maybe get to a certain limit. Like I started running, I wasn't trying to make a living from it. I wasn't trying to be a professional runner. I just thought, oh, this will be a fun thing to do. Let's see if I can finish this hard race. And then over the years, suddenly I start thinking, a 3-hour marathon, that would be an amazing thing. Can I achieve that? Then you get the 3 hour, and then maybe I can do a 250, then 245, and suddenly you keep raising the bar of where you think that limit is. And after a while, you realize that you don't know where the limit is. All you can do is
Right.
keep pushing yourself to get better. And so for anyone who's newer to running and they think, oh, I'm not a runner, or I get sore knees, or I'm a little bit heavier than the average runner, or whatever it may be, you honestly don't know how good you could be. I've had people who come to me saying, could you get me to the Olympics? And I
Yeah.
won't say no to them, but I will say we don't know how good you could be until we see. And we definitely don't want to put an artificial limit on that because of your age or because of past performance. But all that we can generally say is that when you train well and you learn better skill sets and be able to execute better in races, you will improve massively. But who knows how much? But usually it's much more than people think.
Yeah, and if you can just further allude to this, is there something like limits? How do you know there is a limit, like sub 3 or a BQ or winning an ultra could be some of the, or even completing a first 100K, or some of these could be great aspirational values to get started with, and as you progress, like you said, your goalpost keeps changing. How can people structurally, institutionally figure out if there is a limit? Are there genes, training, any other variables that come in play, or is just everything is a function of maybe just consistently you working hard and figuring out, is it trial and error, or is there more to it?
There's definitely going to be some trial and error. I think the main thing would be not to just set one limit and think, well, if I can get there, that would be the peak of what I can ever be, because you just don't know what your peak would be. So whether that is a particular marathon time, whether it's completing a certain type of race, whatever that may be, the one thing I'd say is that with good training and enough time to fit in training, obviously people have work and lives that get in the way of being able to get some kind of optimum training. If you look at a top level marathoner, they might be sleeping 12 or 10 or 12 hours a day. Most people can't afford to do that. Or they can't have a run in the morning and then a nap in the afternoon and sleep all night. And there's going to be kids getting in the way and work schedules and all these kind of things. So that will typically be a limit that means that most people probably won't get to the Olympics. I mean, that's a fairly obvious thing, but we don't know
Sure.
just from starting training whether someone has the potential to be an Olympian. You will often hear about people who they don't necessarily sound like they were great athletes in the first place, and then they get to the absolute top of their sport. So you don't know that that's not you. But also realistically, if you can only fit in half an hour 3 times a week, you're not going to be able to get to your physical limit. It's the more you can do, the volume that you can put in will have a big effect. And that's something that often you'll find that the more you get used to running and the more it becomes a habit, the easier it is to fit that in. But there's still going to be limits realistically of how much you can do and how well you can recover from that. If you're someone who is working long hours in a stressful job, you come back and you've got screaming kids and you don't get to sleep well because of that, that is undoubtedly going to have an effect on the amount of training you can do that your body can absorb, and therefore how much you'll be able to keep improving. But I think the main thing is to know that maybe that means at the moment you're a little bit more limited, but maybe a few years later the job's a bit less stressful, the kids are sleeping the whole night, and that allows you to train a bit harder. And so the consistent training and build up over a number of years still pays off and gives you those improvements. So I would say that's universal amongst everyone I've ever coached, that they can always do more than they initially thought. And I would say most people are capable of completing even a 100-miler given time. So it's not like anyone could just run it in 5 weeks. But even for someone very out of shape and a little bit older, just give them enough time. And a 100-mile race is a very possible thing for the majority of the human race to be able to do. And I think most people wouldn't realize that. But probably the limiting factor there as well is the desire to do it. For example, my wife doesn't particularly like running. So even though I know that physically with enough training, she'd be able to complete a 100-miler, she would never do that training and she wouldn't have enough desire in the race to push herself. And so that would be the limiting factor there, just the willingness to put in the work and on race day to care enough. And not everyone's going to care that much. They're not going to want to push themselves to those extremes necessarily. So often it may be just a mental thing of how much you want to achieve within it and how much you want to dedicate to the sport. Because someone like me, I've dedicated my life now to running, but for most people, it's going to be a little bit lower priority than that. And that will also probably limit how much they're willing to put in for training time, how much they're willing to push potentially on race day, and what a priority that is compared to other priorities in life as well.
Very, very important points, and thank you for those. I wanted to go back to the first point where you mentioned at the start of the podcast, where you said you used to work for Deloitte, and then later you moved to professional running, and you have been immensely successful in the ultra running world as well as in the coaching. Can you reflect on this journey, how you made this transition, and also some of the key traits that kept you going? While I have taken notes of some of these through this discussion already, but you've been in this for a long time, and what has been some of your learnings as well as motivations that just kept you going and made you this successful in this area?
Yeah, so I mean, I did a kind of normal university life, and then going to work in London, and that was just after the dot-com bust. So it wasn't as busy for the first year or so there. But after 2 or 3 years, I just found that the city lifestyle wasn't allowing me to exercise as much, or it wasn't as healthy. And so I started running at that point. Found myself enjoying it and getting really quite addicted to it. I mean, I think the most I was doing at that point was maybe about 30 marathons in a year. And that was in different cities all over Europe. So I would have a typical weekend of fly early on Saturday morning from London to whichever European city, go straight to the expo, go and sleep in a youth hostel, do the race Sunday morning, shower in the youth hostel, fly right back, and then
Wow.
around a little bit on Monday in the office. And so that was literally every weekend. People stopped asking. It's like, oh, you did another marathon this weekend. Yeah, that's just what you do now. So I just kind of enjoyed that and started finding that the running side of my life was more of a focus than just the career side. But I was an economist for a number of years there. And then I moved over to doing economic stuff in the US as well in 2009. But I mainly moved over to the US to get married. So my wife is American, so that was the reason I came here. But I also found that I was working in San Jose in the Bay Area. So think of the middle of Silicon Valley, all of these kind of entrepreneurs everywhere. And that made me think a little bit more about, okay, well, I've having some success with running. I've won some races, been able to start getting sponsors. And literally after the biggest success I had at that point, which was a 100-miler called Rocky Raccoon 100-miler in Texas,
Yeah.
I set the course record there, and it was one of the fastest trail 100-mile times ever at that point. And because of that, I thought, you know what, I should probably dedicate myself to this a bit more. And so I ideally wanted to go and try and work for one of my sponsors. So I tried to get a job at the North Face, which was my shoe sponsor at the time, but unfortunately wasn't able to find any openings there. So instead, I started thinking, well, what else could I do in the running industry? What would be enjoyable? And just as I'm thinking like that, my mind is open to ideas. Friends of mine, because they'd seen the success I'd had said, hey, would you mind coaching me? And so I said, well, kind of on an informal basis, I'll help. You know, I don't really have the skill set to do that yet. I've done years of practice on myself. I've read a lot of books about training, definitely a lot of trial and error with myself. And that was about 5 years into my running journey at that point. But then I also thought, well, okay, if I'm going to do that, potentially I could be a coach and do that as a career. And so I looked into getting some simple qualifications from the US Track and Field Authority, from I actually became a certified personal trainer briefly, just to be able to get some more skill set around just general fitness training, and kept trying to read as many books as I could about all the different training techniques. There aren't as many to do with ultras. More of it is to do with marathon running. But there's a lot of overlap there in terms of the fitness, and then a lot more of the kind of psychology books for endurance sports that apply more to ultras and to Ironman and stuff like that. So I really just tried to learn what I could, and then gradually build things up. And so I started coaching a few people. That was 2010. And then by about 2011, that was basically my full-time job. And I left my job at Deloitte. But it was very much a desire to do something that I really enjoyed and was passionate about. And I'd had a few years of gaining enough experience. And then also, it just happened to be the job I was doing in San Jose I hated. So that was actually probably the biggest thing. So this is maybe what people could relate to more. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, I gave up a job that I liked and went into a new career. It's another thing to leave a job that you're really just not enjoying. I only worked for 10 months in San Jose, but it was not a good fit for what I was doing. It's like tax economic stuff, and I was not interested at all. It was a super stressful job. Not very well managed as well, I have to admit. And it just felt like I couldn't do that. There's no way that I would keep doing that for the rest of my life. So I had to find something to do with running. And so that sense of urgency really made a difference there.
Oh wow, it's been quite a journey, isn't it? So, uh, you found the interest and you went after it, made sure then the environment around you became conducive to what you set forth to do, and it's phenomenal. You talked about Rocky Raccoon, you talked about Leadville 100 miler, 170 kilometer. I'm converting for sake of translation here in India. 160.9, correct, yes. Um, and also Comrades. You have had some great successes there. Do you want to talk about some of those experiences? Anything that was most challenging, anything that was most interesting? For example, Rocky Raccoon, you set the fastest course record, and there have been like so many records to your name, so not to count on those, but what did you find most interesting and why? Which course and how was that? If you can share some of that experiences, will be fantastic as well.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Leadville is definitely one of my favorites at the moment because I just love the fact that I can go to Colorado. It's in the mountains in Colorado, very high altitude. So
Yeah.
Leadville town itself is just over 3,000 meters high, and most of the race is above that. It goes up to about 12,600 feet. So that's about, I don't know, 3,800 meters, I think, or 3,700, something like that. So very high up,
Yeah.
enough that you can really feel the altitude and it can make you sick. So I've always lived at sea level. Where I live now in Oregon, I'm about 1,000 meters up, which is not really altitude. It's low enough that you don't get really any effect from it. So I've never really lived high up, and most of the places were basically sea level: London, San Jose, etc. But I just found it a really interesting challenge to see how I could cope with altitude, how I could just enjoy being in the mountains. I mean, a lot of the races I now prefer are more mountain based because they're just more scenic. Western States and Leadville, they're not known as being super mountainous races, but they have mountainous sections to them, as well as some very runnable bits to them. And I just love them. I mean, they're both such historical races. They've also had some really fast runners run them over the years. Western States gets loads of fast people every year. Leadville just gets usually a couple of people who are quick. But over the years, many of the fastest runners in the 100-mile area have given it a go. And so I just like seeing how I can stack up against that and see how I can keep learning. And really, it comes back to how I first got into running, which was seeing the challenge of, here's something difficult. What's the best I can do with it? And then you give it a go and you say, what can I learn from that? How can I improve it? Both from thinking of it from a scientific point of view of what could I change in training, what things are the latest, what's the latest knowledge and the latest research, what should make a difference, particularly related to altitude, because there's very specific elements there that make a difference. And then also seeing how I can apply that to other people. So I love the fact that I then get to train others for these same races. And it's not like you ever get to the point of becoming the perfect amount of knowledge. It's a constant learning process, but that's really fun. That's the biggest thing I'd say across all of running and across all of coaching is that you're constantly learning. You're constantly trying to improve and work out what you can get a little bit better. It's a constant search for perfection, and you'll never get perfection, but you can get the occasional race that's really close. And I had probably my first one at Leadville was one of the most perfect ones I had there. They've all been pretty good, close to how I'd want them to be. But that first one just kind of went like a dream. It's always nice when it's a race you're not familiar with, and I'd never raced certainly that far at that high altitude. And is also in the middle of something called the Grand Slam, which was 400 milers in the same summer. So 4 of the original ones from like the 80s in the US. And then you add the time up for all 4 of them. And that was the third of the 4 races. So that made it especially interesting to me. But it was just fun to go there, have a couple of weeks of acclimating at altitude, enjoying myself, hiking around the mountains, seeing the sights, and then getting to do this epic historic race. And so, yeah, I absolutely love Leadville. I'm going to go back there again this year, and that'll be my 6th time there. And I'd like to keep doing more. And actually, one of the things that I find when we talk about goal setting is I constantly try and find new goals to aim for. So it's not just about trying to get faster or trying to win a race. It's things like just, big macro goals. So I've got 10 finishes at Western States. I've got 7 at Comrades, 7 at Boston. I'd like to make those 10. I'd like to do 10 at Leadville as well. So I've got 5 at Leadville, but I'd love to have 10 finishes at all 4 of those races. And I'm pretty sure no one's ever done all of them 10 times, but there are things associated with that. So 10 Western States, you get a particular buckle for that. 10 Leadvilles, you get a buckle as well. And 10 Comrades, you get what's called a green number, where you all have a kind of random number up to about 50,000 that you're given initially. But if you keep coming back, you use the same number. And then after you finish 10 times, they retire that number and it's yours for life. So my number's, I think, 37,000 and something. It's not a particularly memorable number. I can't even think what it is. But after I've done 10 finishes, no one else will ever wear that same race number again. And you have a green color to your bib so that anyone who sees you there knows you've done 10 finishes. You get kind of a bit of kudos for that. You get some extra areas at the start and the finish that you can go to because you've got a green number. So I kind of like this extra goal of having these long-term things that, doing 10 years of a race, just the time it takes to do that. I mean, the minimum amount of time is a decade, never mind the fact that that's usually going to be spread over a longer period than that. But Comrades is another one that I would just love to do that with. Haven't been there for a few years because I focused a little bit more on Western States the last few years, and then we've had no travel for the last year. I was meant to be doing Comrades last year, but that one is just such a fantastic race. So it's a double marathon, basically. It's typically 90 kilometers. And it changes direction each year in South Africa. And it was one of the first really big international races that I did. So I think the first year I did it was maybe 2007. So one of the earlier ones that I did. And I've just gone back as many times as I can because the atmosphere there is just unbelievable. Absolutely fantastic event. The people locally, it's such a big deal for them. And part of that is because of during the time when they weren't allowed to do any international competition because of apartheid. So South Africaners could only race or compete locally. So national level sports became that much more important. And Comrades in particular just got elevated to be kind of their equivalent of the London Marathon, the New York Marathon, the Boston Marathon, but probably even bigger than that realistically, because it just became this iconic thing. And even people who aren't really into running much seem to have done it, even though it's not just a marathon, it's much, much longer than that. And yet they're still into it. So that gives you an idea of how passionate about they are about it and why I love it so much. But I can't wait to go back there. And that's also another place where I feel like I had one of my near perfect days. So the fastest time I ran there did feel like, for the fitness I had at the time, I kind of got all the tactics right, got about as close to my potential on the day, which isn't the same as the potential you could have with a perfect build-up and everything else. But I felt like I was in decent shape and I had a really good race. And so just that's the kind of thing that I tried to replicate. And there's a lot of satisfaction in doing that. And I think I was 23rd that day in the race. So it's a super competitive one. So, that's to me very fast because I'm not a super fast road runner, but it just really meant a lot to me, and going there and trying to improve on that would be a really big goal of mine as well.
Beautiful, and you make it sound so easy and modest, but yeah, it's phenomenal. I have a friend who has a green number, and each time we discuss about Comrades and or we are in a forum together, he talks about, and it's just so inspirational to hear of his stories, and I see similar sentiments from you. It's just fantastic, the kind of richness of experiences, the underlying traits of consistency, training, and experiencing that journey at least for a decade to get a green number. It's just fantastic. Thanks for that. You also talked about you were in India for about a month or so. Was it for running or something else?
No, not at all. No, it was because I studied economics at university, so it was about really geeky subject, but the Indian software industry's effect on the economic development of India. So I was going around to particularly tech hubs within India and trying to interview some people and just trying to learn a little bit more. But it meant I spent a lot of time on trains because I was a poor student and that was the easiest way to get around. And it takes a long time to get anywhere on a train if you're trying to go across all of India. But I certainly, I enjoyed being there. I did get a bit of illness while I was there for about a week, but it was a fantastic place to visit, and also meant a little bit more to me. What you wouldn't know this, but my dad was actually born in India, so he's not Indian, but he's an English guy. But his dad was working in the leather industry, and they were living in what used to be Madras, Chennai.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
Chennai.
my dad, his first 7 years of his life, lived in Chennai.
Oh, wow. Such a small world, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, India since has evolved significantly, as you'd know. India is a big country, but the trains have become a lot faster. The journeys have become a lot more convenient, and like I said, running scene has improved significantly as well. We have a few ultra races. There are stadium runs that happen on the track, 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, where people just taking rounds in a stadium on a 400-meter track. Some of those have been pretty exciting as well as boring at the same time. Like you just keep taking
I know
loops,
exactly what
but
you mean. That is what our sport is. It's super exciting
yeah,
and also
yeah,
super boring. It's like, okay, well, what's
true.
changed in the last 5 minutes? Nothing. This is
Yeah, yeah,
going to
yeah,
last all day long. But what, particularly watching things via Twitter has become a popular thing
yeah.
in the last decade. Of whether it's Western States or UTMB or any major race, and just drip feeding the information through Twitter. And there's better ways that are starting to do that, but it is a fairly slow motion thing. Someone makes a move and it takes
Yeah.
hours for that move to play out. It's not like a track race at the Olympics where they make the move and they go past the person and sprint into the finish 1 minute later.
True, true. And yeah, maybe at some point we would love to welcome you to India as well for one of the trail races.
I love travel, and I haven't been to India since 2002. So I would certainly love to come back as a runner and do a race at some point.
It will be fantastic to have you in some way or other coming into India in the near future. Moving on, you have been in some of the Guinness Book Records as well. Pretty interesting costume races. Why don't you talk about some of those as well?
Yeah, and that fits in with the same idea, which is just having different goals. So after I'd
Right.
done maybe 50 marathons, I saw an advert in the London Marathon magazine. It used to be that you had to apply physically for the London Marathon. You had to fill in a form and you had to get it from the London Marathon magazine. It was only available in running stores. And this isn't even that long ago, but now you can all do it all online. But in that, it was saying we're going to give a £1,000 prize to the fastest Elvis because they're partnering with Guinness World Records, which is also based in London. And so they're going to give a Guinness World Record for it. So I think there were 4 of us on the day in 2007 that gave that a go. I managed to be the fastest one. And I was just thinking, well,
I think
I'm
it
doing
was
all these
258, wasn't it?
257 for that one. Yeah.
Right.
It was,
Nice.
I'd never run in a costume before, but London is one that is known for it. So unlike most marathons around the world, a good portion of the people in London are there running for charity. And it's much easier to raise money for charity if you wear a silly costume than if you just say, hey, sponsor me to run 26 miles, because these days lots of people have done that. So it doesn't sound quite as impressive. So I wasn't doing it purely to raise money for charity. I did raise a little bit as well, but it was mainly just I could win £1,000. That sounded awesome. Why not, for the sake of buying a cheap costume? That sounded like a nice, fun thing. And then when I finished it, I saw all these other people who got all these other records. They had fastest superhero and fastest this and that. And I thought I could do some of those because the times weren't super quick. It's people finishing in 4.5, 5 hours in a costume where the costume wouldn't really slow them down more than a couple of minutes. So I then did fastest superhero, did that one a few times. I've done Elvis a few times as well. I've run it in places like Napa Valley, so in California. I did it in Vegas. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the record there, but a friend of mine, Mike Wardian, when he ran in Vegas as Elvis, which is obviously an iconic place to be Elvis, he also won the race.
Yeah.
So he set the record for the Guinness World Record, as well as being the winner of the actual event, which was kind of cool.
Wow.
So yeah, I did superhero. I dressed as Spider-Man. Did that one in Edinburgh and also in Napa Valley actually, and that was about 250, I think. And someone's broken that since then. I think the record for Elvis now is 236. So that's got a little bit quicker as well. And then I just did a couple of other ones that seemed kind of fun. So I did fastest Santa. I did that actually 1 week after running the Marathon des Sables. So I came back and wasn't able to move much, having finished the race, and then ran as Santa the following week in London and got that record. And again,
And that was fastest?
Wow.
yes. So that was like a 3-hour 15 marathon or something, and someone's gone well under that time now. And then the one other one that I've done was fastest movie character. And so I ran as Maximus from the movie Gladiator. So he has the mask on, and that's from about 20 years ago, that movie. And so I had a gladiator outfit, I had a plastic sword, and it was the proper Maximus one, not just a general gladiator thing, but I did that in Rome. So I was running around the Colosseum is where the finish line and the start line are, running along with this silly little plastic sword in my hands. But the difference between London, where they expect a costume, and so everyone is cheering. In fact, it was absolutely deafening how loud it was. I got to the point in the last few kilometers of the London Marathon where I would see people 100 meters ahead of me turn around and go and just be wondering what this loud cheering is for. It's because I was the first person in a costume, and the crowd went absolutely mental for it. They were so insanely loud that it was almost deafening. I mean, it was almost painful to my ears how loud the crowd was, which I think is probably like if you were in first place, you got that amount of cheering. And then unfortunately, there'd be all these super fast people just behind that, and they'd be like, yeah, you're good, but you're not winning. And then the first interesting stuff to them of, anyone who looks silly, they suddenly get a massive cheer as well. But in Italy, no. Costume running is weirdos. You do not do that. So I just got a lot of people in the crowd just staring at me with a kind of a frown, thinking that I was a very unusual person and why on earth would I do a marathon in this non-serious way. So I found that actually extra amusing, but it was a complete contrast there to finish in London with a crowd. It's like you just won the World Cup. It's an insane amount of cheering. While in Rome, it's just like no one clapping, and they actually stop clapping for you because they think you're weird.
Right, very nice. Very, very interesting. So the last question, Ian, I have for you, in running in the heat in India, specifically for ultra races, it gets very hot through the day, and specifically in Mumbai, where the temperature is in early 90s in Fahrenheit, and with the humidity of at times up to 90-95%. And you have done a number of races in very, very hot conditions. How did you approach some of those? And I'm asking this question specifically on behalf of ultra runners, because this was something I was asked a few days ago to ask you. How did you approach, and if there are some tips that you'd want to give to ultra runners who are approaching the races in hot conditions?
No, definitely. That's a really good question. And there's two kind of elements there. I mean, there's the extreme heat and then there's extreme humidity. And humidity is a lot harder to deal with because the way the body cools itself is by sweating, basically. And then the sweat evaporates as well as the blood going to the edge of the skin, and that allows some radiation out of the skin. So if you can do some heat training in advance of the race, you don't actually need to do that much. So, or in advance of summer weather. So even just having about 10 sessions of about an hour spread over about 3 weeks, which could be as simple as just running when it's hot. So if it starts getting to hot weather after 2 or 3 weeks of running in that, you're going to be about as well adapted to it as you can be. And so that's for the body's own adaptation. So when I've done races like Western States, that gets up to above 40 degrees, and then even more when you've got direct sunlight, or I've paced multiple times and coach people as well for Badwater, where it can be even hotter than that. It can be more like 50 degrees. And in fact, Badwater is the place that has the highest recorded temperature on Earth. So absolutely incredible temperatures. And they're going there and doing the race in July, in the hottest month. And so it gets so insanely hot there that even just standing around, you're almost fainting. So you want to be as heat adapted as you can be, but that won't be enough when you've got these extreme Indian summer and humid kind of temperatures. So what instead you've got to be able to do is ideally pick cooler times of day as well to do your runs, and many races will also do that. But if you've got as much heat adaptation as you can, which is simply from just having a stimulus of multiple times running in the heat, then pouring liquids on your head makes a massive difference, particularly if the liquid is below air temperature. So if you're able to run with iced water, or if you're in a race and you're able to get hold of ice and water, then you can pour that on your head, and that will be externally cooling your body. So that makes a massive difference. But even just pouring water on your head that is air temperature will help. The difficulty here is that isn't nearly as effective when it's very humid, because the more humid it is, going up to 100% humidity, at 100%, you won't have any evaporation of that, or basically no evaporation of that liquid. And so it won't have that same cooling effect as it draws the heat away. So that's where it's even more important to have liquid that is colder than the air and or ice. And so if you look at people at Western States and at Badwater, even those are very dry heat, so almost zero humidity, people are getting ice at every aid station, or in Badwater, you have to have your own crew. And so, in fact, within Death Valley for Badwater, the crews have to have ice chests with dry ice in them and then ice bags on top of that, because otherwise the ice will melt too quickly. So the dry ice, you're never putting that on you. I mean, you can't even touch that. It's just to keep things even colder. And that's extremely cold. But it then allows you to keep these ice bags and be able to make use of that through the course to give to the runner. So external cooling is the main thing, making use of shade wherever possible. And that even includes things like covering more of the skin. So you'll often see people at Badwater or Western States, men who are running topless. This is not
Yeah.
the best way to do it, because you're then going to get a lot of radiated heat from the sun going into the skin, when in fact what you want to do, which I'm sure everyone in India already knows, is have clothing that covers the skin so that that radiates the heat out. That's also why you want lighter colors, because that will radiate more heat, and therefore your skin won't absorb as much heat, and that will help keep you a little bit cooler. And even more so if you can keep that clothing wet. So things like, again, pouring ice cold water on your head, keeping a t-shirt wet. If it's a humid day, it will stay wet for a long time. If it's a race like Badwater, you can pour a bottle of water over your head, get your t-shirt dripping wet. 5 minutes later, it's completely dry because it's all evaporated. So you've just got to do that a lot more frequently. But definitely the humidity is the biggest angle there, that you can't just pour room temperature stuff over your head and expect it to work as effectively. And also it means that your sweat mechanism won't be as effective, because that won't be evaporating either. So you've really got to try and do things externally as much as possible, as well as generating less heat on your body. So that means both avoiding the direct sunlight where possible, because it can often be quite a lot hotter. I mean, it can easily be 20 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's about 8 degrees or so Celsius hotter being in direct sunlight versus being in the shade. As I'm sure everyone's found, if you go underneath a tree for a sec, it's like, oh, that's so much more pleasant, because there's a significant drop in how hot it feels. And then just trying to make sure that you can generate less heat by going slower as well. So you can't afford to run quite as hard if it's really hot, because you will generate more heat within the body, creating that heat from the exercise you're doing. So you've got to be even more cautious about keeping that to a low level.
Sure. And does that translate into a different type of fueling and hydration during the race as well? Because you're not evaporating efficiently, and so I would assume that the athletes should be fueling differently than they would be doing on a normal warm day. And
A little bit, yeah. I mean, typically you're still going to be sweating a lot. It just won't be evaporating. It'll just be dripping off you more rather than evaporating. So the amount of liquid you're losing that way is still going to be much higher on a hot day. So you will typically want to drink more because of that. Drinking to thirst is a pretty accurate way to do that. I mean, if you've got a dry mouth, keep drinking, and you will naturally want to drink more on a hot day as you're sweating a lot. And so that way you can get in more calories, maybe through drinks. So a good example here is Magda Boulet, who I've coached, and she's a former Western States winner. And she actually did Western States only off liquid calories. She didn't eat any solid food, because she was able to use, I think it was gu-roctane, which is you can put as a powder in liquids. And then because she needed to drink so much, she was having to drink enough to get in a lot of calories that way. While that same tactic wouldn't work as well in a cold race, because you wouldn't need to drink as much. And therefore, if you only had calories that way, you wouldn't take as many in. So it is harder to digest when it's hotter. That's another one of the downsides, that your stomach is more likely to get upset. So you've got to be even more careful about the types of things that you're eating, the variety of what you're eating, and you'll probably not be able to eat quite as much, because one of the reasons why you can't digest as much is that you need a lot of blood flow to the digestive system to digest. And so exercise already prioritizes more of that to the legs, so that makes it harder to digest, even if it's cold weather. But then when it's hot weather, more of that blood goes to the edge of the skin to try and radiate out the heat, and that means again that it's even less available for digestion. So it just means there's more chance of having stomach issues. So certain foods that you might be able to eat on a cold day, maybe you can't eat on a hot day, or maybe you can't eat as much solid food on a hot day, which means ideally to get in some or more of your calories through the drinks that you're having as well. So if I'm running something like Western States, I typically have 2 handheld bottles. One of them that will have some kind of sports drink, energy drink, something that has calories, and the other one that will just be all day, just water filled with ice that I can keep pouring on my head. And I can also use that to kind of wash out my mouth from the sugary things that I'd be eating through the day, just to clean my palate a little bit. But that's mainly being used to pour on my head and keep me cool.
Very, very informative. Thank you so much for these. This will add a great value to our Ultra Clan. Jan, thank you so much for speaking with me. It has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will value this a great deal. I would request that I could get back to you if there are any subsequent questions from our listeners, etc. I think, and if you could address some of those, that will be fantastic. But it has been a fantastic conversation.
Great talking to you. No, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. We have a lot more to offer on nutrition, training, and fitness. Check the Fitpage app or visit our website, fitpage.in.